Dr. William Myers, from Pennsylvania, and Goshen College grad 1 year behind me. Knew him for several years. After which went to Vietnam under international voluntary service. At a certain point, felt that they could no longer serve in Vietnam without being identified with the U.S. military. As I recall, they were on the front page of the New York Times when a group of IDS members announced that they could no longer serve in Vietnam. Went to the Philippines, where he met a woman who became his wife. Came back, did a PhD at the University of Minnesota, and then was a professor for many years at Iowa State University in agriculture. Retired from there and took a position, I guess instead of a postdoc, a post-retirement position, and has been very active at the University of Missouri. He happens to be in Washington, D.C., where he was hosting some scholars from Bosnia, and he's agreed this morning to talk about the complexity of food policy. Whatever I forgot in your biography, Willie, you'll have to fill in. He's already discovered there are people here that he does know, and we're delighted to have you sharing it with us. Willie?
Thanks, Del. No, the only, I guess, correction to what you said is that I moved to University of Missouri as a professor so I had my last 20 years there. So I'm retired a couple of different times already. So I know about retirement. It's because I've had such experience retiring. Thanks a lot for inviting me, and I'm trying to set this up so that I can finish in 30 minutes and we have time for discussion. But I was saying that if somebody wants to ask something along the way, I'll try to answer it quickly also. I don't know how many of you, let me see if I can change I'm trying to move the slide. Oh, there we go. So I have a little retrospective here myself. And I don't know how many of you remember William Pollard, who gave a lecture during our time at Goshen. It was called Chance and Providence. He was a nuclear physicist and an Episcopal minister. So I stole his title in a way, Serendipity and Providence, in my life, because you may know I was a math major. I didn't know what to do with myself. And I found out when I was in Vietnam, I met John Mellor, who was I think he's still living, actually. He must be over 90 years old by now, but he is a very famous agricultural economist, and he was on the board of directors for IVS. And he told me that a mathematician can be an economist. So that's how I got into studying ag economics at the University of the Philippines. And another highlight in terms of my direction of my life, when I went to Iowa State, there was a guy named Earl Hetty there who was very much engaged with working with the Soviet Union and Central East European countries. And we because of him, we had an association with that started in the late 70s, before the Soviet Union broke up with the Soviet Union. And then because of that, I got to work a lot in the Baltics and Central Eastern Europe, and especially in the Baltic states and Hungary and Ukraine. and that had a lot of, that sort of changed my regional work. I was working a lot in Asia before that, and then I began to work a lot in these former communist countries of Europe. And then finally, another point of change in my career was going to FAO in '99, and Jacques Diouf was then the Director General of FAO. And that got me involved in food security issues. And so these are all things that will come in to our discussion. I will not talk a lot about Ukraine, although I'm very much engaged in that right now, but we could do another session on Ukraine later on. So what I would like to do, let's see if I got my timer on here. I set up a timer so I would not run over. Is to talk about poverty and hunger, the 4 C's that have come to be identified with hunger issues, measurement of food security, current conditions in global food security, and then a bit about the impact of the Russian war on Ukraine, and then policy, some policy do's and don'ts and measures that have been suggested. So that's kind of where I want to move. And as I said, I'll move pretty quickly through many of these things so we have time for discussion later on. I'm sure many of you know or remember Amartya Sen, and I want to emphasize him because I think a lot of what we've learned over the years is that poverty is the main problem in terms of food security around the world, and there are lots of other factors, but Amartya Sen really emphasized to all of us that poverty is the central problem. And it comes out also in some of the data that I'm going to be showing here. Some of this is older, some of it's newer, but here's one that just shows the correlation between on the left-hand scale, prevalence of undernourishment, which was the traditional measurement that FAO was using, and the growth in GDP per capita, and it's clear relationship. And then this is one of the charts I'm going to show about what's happened in recent years. One of the big success stories in global poverty and food security has been the reduction of poverty. Really, it's been much more successful than reducing food insecurity. But as this figure shows, COVID has really knocked knocked a hole in the progress in reducing poverty. And the same thing you will see in some of the food security data. Here's one of the measures. This was a traditional FAO measure of the number and percent of people undernourished in the world. And I'll show you later, there's a new one that they've developed several years ago, but it has the same trajectory, especially that COVID has really knocked a loop into the progress that has been made. Progress in reducing food insecurity has been much slower than the progress in reducing poverty. Another older picture, which I just added, COVID and cost here, but for many years, the focus has been on the factors that have been correlated or causing hunger in the world, and conflict is there all the time. And this kind of shows climate change, hunger, conflict, and climate together. Even it's a little surprising that Ukraine is already in this picture, but that's because of the attacks that Russia made on Ukraine in 2014. So anyway, that was already in the picture back then. And then coming again to the COVID issue, this is comparing 3 years. And even a lot of this data doesn't really reflect yet the recent war effects, but mainly the COVID effects. And this is showing that in actually before COVID, there was some improvement, especially in Asia. This negative effect here, and then again here is the reduction or the increase in the number of people who can't afford a healthy diet, especially in 2019, 2020, but especially in Asia and Africa, not so much in Latin America or in our region. Using the same 3 periods, this just shows the change in the cost of a healthy diet. So it's partly the rising cost and partly also the COVID effects, which are more health effects, which have influenced or made, let's say, increase the cost and thereby increase the problem of food insecurity in these different regions. So I want to talk a little bit about the measurement because, as I said, a few years ago, FAO changed their approach to measuring food insecurity. They hired a statistician from University of Naples who kind of turned their estimates upside down and and they adopted what was used for many years, that has been used for probably 30 years or more in the US, of asking people, finding whether you're food insecure. It was called an experiential measure. And the idea is that a person is not food secure unless they feel they are food secure. A person is not food secure if they have experienced conditions caused by food insecurity. So, as I said, this was adopted actually probably more than 30 years ago in the US as part of our measurement of food insecurity in the US. So it's an experienced condition, and ranging from low food insecurity where you worry about obtaining food, and then increasingly as you move across the severity of this, finally experiencing hunger and even worse, starvation. So this is laid out in this chart as kind of the experiential thing, and then the consequences. So on the experience scale, from worries to compromising quality and compromising quantity, like skipping a meal or not eating for a day, and then hunger. And you have the effects on well-being related to each one of those, the welfare reduction, malnutrition, undernutrition, and starvation. And I think many of you probably are aware that, this is even true on our own campuses. We have students who fall into some of these food insecure categories. So they do this, and the FAO does this by using Gallup World Poll to sample in these different countries, asking these questions. And based on the answers to these questions, then they have developed a measurement which looks like this. So there's food that are food secure, and then there's moderate food insecurity, which is the yellow part in this circle, and severe food insecurity, which is the red part of this circle. So they report this now in these 3 categories, and so the numbers, because the actual numbers of people who are either moderately or severely food insecure, you'll see coming up in some of the later figures that I will show. this is an older version that I pulled out so I could get some individual country comparisons, so you can get an idea how we compare across time. Well, not across time, but across countries, and from maybe the worst to the what we would consider to be our own or developed country situations. So the blue part is moderate or severe, and the red part is just severe food insecurity. And I picked a couple of the more severe cases and compare it to the US and other developed countries to indicate that these measures do show up in even in high income countries, but of course at a much lower level. So that's to give you an idea how some of the measures that we'll see in the recent report. So I've taken some data from this. If you aren't familiar with this, this is an annual report that comes out every year. This was one of my responsibilities when I was in FAO, although back in those days it was called the State of Food Insecurity, and now it's become a more positive title in a way, State of Food Insecurity and Nutrition. And there's been a lot more emphasis in recent years on nutrition aspects, not just calorie content of the food. And I circled the bottom part here because Del mentioned that you were interested also in looking at policies, and I noticed in this report that they have I would say a rather revolutionary idea of repurposing food and agricultural policies, which I'll refer to a little bit later. So out of this report, I pulled some of the more recent statistics, and this is the way the new data is. I'm going to change the view here. I think, where is it? Okay, it's all right. So you can see as we get into Africa, this would be the more severe case, where the red part is the biggest share of compared with the other regions, and the red and yellow together would be the severe and food insecure. So and the US and Europe being in this area. So as usually the case, Asia and Africa have the largest shares. And then this is a similar chart, but this is based on income level. So again, you kind of see where the most severe situations are based on income. Again, the correlation between income and food insecurity is obvious, as it has been in the other measures as well. So this is just repeating the chart that I showed before, because now I want to show the new chart, which is based on the new measure, which has the same shape. I mean, it has a similar shape, a gradual decline for some years, and then being shooting up in the last couple of years because of COVID. So this is now the new chart, and I put I will share these slides. So if you want to look up any of these things, I put URLs in some of these to make it easier to find some of those sources. So this does not yet even include the period related to the war in Ukraine, but this is just the COVID and the economic effects, the COVID and say price effects of the higher costs that occurred even before the war. So this is already, increasing the last couple of years to the food insecurity, and then again here sorry, this line down here is the food the severe food insecurity, and this one up here is the food insecurity or moderate food insecurity. So again, there's only a little bit of information on what happened since the war effects during the last year. So here is the sort of the global picture of the food insecurity and the number of undernourished total here, and how it's divided up regionally in Africa and Asia primarily, and then a little bit somewhat smaller area in Latin America. And then the next picture is showing the kind of according to the income level, and again, it's relating the importance of poverty on the food insecurity. Here we have again the 2 years, and this is the impact of the pandemic on the food insecurity in these different income. Even in the higher income parts of the world, as we know in the U.S., this has had a negative impact because of COVID. And looking at the regional measures, I wanted to show this because you can see a little bit the differences in the regions. And actually in Asia here, there was actually a slight improvement in the 2021. The biggest negative, let's say, increase, the biggest increase in food insecurity was in the Africa region, and even a little bit in North America and Europe. And then another measure that they show in this report is the difference between men and women. The higher in every region, including in North America and Europe, food insecurity among women is higher than men, and the difference is largest in the Africa region, right here. Which is also an important aspect of the food insecurity that's good to know about. Okay, a little bit about the impact of the Russian war on Ukraine, which has, as I said, it's not reflected in most of those statistics from FAO, although I'll show you one chart in that report which does refer to the war. So you probably know Ukraine is a really big country, and this helps to illustrate how large it is relative to some places that we know. And the other important thing here is that Ukraine is a very productive, it's like the Midwest. This is a land quality assessment. Has this green, the light green is the highest soil resilience and the highest soil performance. So the coloring in this region is just what we have in the Midwest, and it practically covers the whole country. That's probably why Russia is so interested in grabbing hold of it. Another important thing about the region is the how important Ukraine and Russia have been. Some of you at least remember that the Soviet Union was an importing country way back in the day. And a lot of changes have happened both in Russia and Ukraine since then. And part of which is a lot less livestock eating grains, but they've exported a lot of wheat and barley, and especially sunflower oil, which is actually 50% of global exports. Sunflower oil come out of Ukraine only, and if you put the two of them together, it's almost 75%. So this is an important factor in terms of how it affects prices in global markets. And another important thing is because of their location, they're just in the Black Sea area where a lot of their exports are coming out of the Black Sea area. A very large share of their customers are in very food insecure countries, Africa and the Middle East in particular. So that's why the impact of the war has been felt so quickly in many of these food insecure areas of the world. And of course, we economists say, well, you can have trade, you just, shift your sources of supply from Ukraine to somewhere else. But in fact, although that's theoretically possible and has happened to some extent, there are a lot of cost factors involved, and aside from the higher shipping costs and so on coming from U.S., South America, or India, there's also the problem of just logistics, shipping costs, and so on. So the other thing that's happened, you may remember during the World Food Crisis of 2008, one of the things that caused things to be even worse was the fact that the countries were trying to protect their own people by either slowing exports or importing more. I remember the Philippines back in 2008. They had sort of a panic buying. They were out buying rice everywhere, and it just drove up the prices in the rest of the world even more. So those kinds of interventions, both the export bans and import, say, acceleration, make the food insecurity situation even worse. And IFPRI, you probably know the International Food Policy Research Institute keeps a lot of track of what's going on here, and I'm using some of there's even a URL here you can look at to get more information and see what they update this from time to time. And they say that the interventions of countries restricting exports or accelerating imports is even worse for a while than it was during the 2008 food crisis. And here's one of the charts that they show. I put the mark on the red line is the Ukraine crisis, what they call it. These are the food restriction or the share of trade that was involved in the restriction. And this one down here is the number of countries that are implementing food export restrictions. So it's worse than the COVID-19. There were some of that in COVID-19 too. It's a little bit better by now than it was during the 2008 food security crisis. We have seen, if you look at price effects, there was a big surge. Prices were already going up before the war. And then they surged and then came back down. So if you look at just our prices in US dollars, prices have pretty well come back to where they were before the war. But the deal is that the dollar has also strengthened at the same time. So for many, I would say most other countries in the world, those prices have not come back down. And in some cases, they remain rather high. Now, these countries here, this is only like a 15% depreciation of those currencies. But if you look at, this is also from an IFPRI chart, the countries that are more food insecure, their currencies have depreciated against the dollar even more. So you have maybe the worst case here is Sri Lanka, which had a big political problem recently, but even Ghana, which is a fairly stable country, more than a 40% change in the the value of their currency relative to the dollar. So for all of these countries, the prices have gone up, have not come back down like they have in the US. So this picture, I mean, this is an article that was in the press so not so long ago, emphasizing the fact that the dollar is a big. In fact, I think this chart comes out of this article right here, and so as a consequence of all of these, this is a April-June the change in the cost of food basket. This is from IFPRI again. In these countries, this is most of these colors are the lighter ones are 10 to 25%, purple is 25 to 100%, and the dark ones, these are countries that cannot afford to get to become more food insecure because they're already in pretty bad shape. So those are impacts, and this is the one from the FAO report, or they just made an estimate based on this number of food insecure, how much that would increase. This is an estimate, obviously, of how much they feel it will increase because of the war. Of course, nobody knows how long the war will go, but we did hear, I think yesterday, that the agreement to allow Ukraine to export grain out of the Black Sea has been stopped by Russia. So the little bit of relief that they had is also going to decline. Okay, so finally, getting down to some of the do's and don'ts and policy issues, I have a few things that we can think about or talk about. IFPRI put out a couple of months ago these do's and don'ts. This is related to let's say to the short-term impacts of this crisis. And the do's would be that they feel that because of one of the big impacts was on vegetable oils, and because of vegetable oils and grains being used for biofuel, they suggested removing the biofuel subsidies and mandates. I'm not aware that the US or Europe have done that. Also, targeting social safety nets to the most needy, boosting WFP and other program funding, and then allowing market price. In other words, going back into letting the markets work. But in the don't section, they didn't talk again about don't apply sanctions that obstruct food and fertilizer trade, because I think I didn't mention it, but you probably know that Russia and Belarus also are the major suppliers of fertilizers to many of these same countries. So that's another thing that's been impacted by the war. Don't implement export restrictions, which a number of countries are still doing. Don't engage in panic buying. Don't target subsidize. Don't try to engineer production outcomes. And more or less, IFPRI's point of view is let markets work and don't intervene to just protect your own market, because it has negative effects on other countries. Now, in this report, which is they also get into a sort of longer term issues about policies, and I thought this was worth bringing up because it's probably not surprising, but it's still remarkable. We know, I think, pretty well that high income countries, we subsidize our agriculture a lot. And this shows that the interesting thing is the way they've organized this. And this is, I think, it's been emphasized in a lot of reports for many years, but this makes it a little bit more, I think, clear. As you move down the income scale, you move from subsidizing agriculture, which you see here, different kinds of subsidies, to actually taxing agriculture. And the worst case is in the lowest income countries. And a lot of times this is done by countries wanting to make food cheaper. Well, if it makes food cheaper for the consumers, then the farmers also get less money. So that is a negative impact on the production and productivity of the country. What they discuss, and I didn't really study it very much yet, except just the concept of the idea, is what they call repurposing of support to agriculture. So what they would like to do is to reduce subsidies in the developed countries and to oh, my timer is buzzing here. Okay, yes, my time is up and I'm almost done. And increase, support in the low income countries, or let's say reduce the taxation of agriculture in the low income countries. They have they call it repurposing of support to food and agriculture, and they go through some scenarios on how they feel that could be done. So I think, like I said, that's a pretty dramatic proposal, and it might be interesting to discuss. So my summary of a lot of this is that I think production is not the big problem. I don't feel that we lack a potential or the possibilities to produce enough food. The problem is income and distribution of the food, and that's partly related to trade and policies, social safety nets, healthcare and sanitation, and also obviously conflict, which I've kind of highlighted them in different colors to emphasize what I think is probably more important than we have to keep on the production, obviously, a technology, but it seems like for the long time, it's the income, the ability or the affordability of people to purchase is the biggest issue. We have, in addition to what's already there, we know that there's a long-term climate change, which is going to make these issues even more severe in the future. So that's where I end, and I say thank you. And Jokuyu is the Ukrainian word for that. So thank you. I will quit there. I'm almost on time.
You're very much on time, given that we started late, held you up for the long service. And we certainly thank you for a fast overview. Just as an aside, John Smith gets credit for suggesting to the Sojourners class that we should talk about hunger. And we decided to try it in two ways. Having the director of the local food bank, the window, with us to talk about it on a local level. And being an economist myself, I reached out to an economist friend to try to give us a fast overview of the big picture. I think we can give ourselves another 5 to 7 minutes for questions. Who would like to offer a comment or a question for Willie?
Yeah, you have a lot of expertise there too, so let's hear what people think.
John Yorney.
Thank you very much for a very informative overview. I really appreciated it. I'm more familiar in what I try to keep up with is continent of Africa. I want to combine two issues that you raised, just ask a question. The two issues are the slide you had showing how many African countries import food, particularly wheat and other grains, for example, that they do not produce. And then the slide you had on the impact of policy on practice, if you will. I'm sort of looking down the road. And to what extent you see the possibility that economic aid to these countries that are insecure and policies within the countries themselves can lead to a change in where the food comes from, particularly growing their own grains, developing their own indigenous crops.
Okay, well, I don't know how much of that you could hear. I'll attempt a quick summary. John Yordi said he's most familiar with Africa. To what extent do you think Africa can shift to being more self-sufficient in producing the food? To what extent can either external aid and or internal policies lead to them becoming more self-sufficient in particularly grain areas?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think when even back in the, it seems like a long time ago now when I was in FAO, but Jacques Diouf, who was the Director General, I mean, he made a big deal about the fact that up at that was about the year 2000. The years leading up to that, the U.S. and Europe was the support for agricultural development in the developing countries was actually declining, and what part of our mission in FAO at that time was to get people back on the supporting agricultural development in these countries, and I think it did make a change. There has been a lot more focus on agriculture and developing, and one of the factors, one of the indicators of that was that, people who were farming in Africa were actually the food insecure themselves. And so I think that's a little bit better than it was 20 years ago, but there's still, if you look at, I'm not really up on the latest information, but the use of fertilizers in Africa was extremely low and still is. Some efforts are made to improve the agricultural systems, but price of fertilizer is also a big problem right now because of the war. So I agree entirely, and I think there's still a lot of, let's say, untapped potential of production in Africa that still needs to be realized.
Thanks, Folsom.
Some years back, I understand that a number of the cheaper pieces of the hog began to enter the market in Haiti, and it decimated their local pork production. Are there examples where aid has an opposite effect?
Are there examples where foreign aid has the opposite effect of the intended? What you do is bring in aid in a form that then disadvantages farmers.
Well, I think that what has also been the case at U.S. Food assistance, because we were disposing of surplus commodities around the world, also depressed the market for local production. I think that has changed quite a bit over the years, and as countries, the U.S. and others came to realize that, I mean, the European Union was ahead of us in doing that, to saying that that we should acquire, and the US now tries to acquire food commodity assistance from the countries, and not just send, well, we don't have the big surpluses that we used to have either. So I think that I'm sure it still happens to some extent, but it's not as bad as it used to be, at least.
Any other comments or questions? Well, Willie, on behalf of Sojourner's class, both those who are here and those online, we certainly thank you for taking time to share with us. We wish you well as you continue, in particular, interacting with folks focused on Ukraine. I think Willie said he's meeting at the Ukrainian embassy tomorrow. So we all wish for the best for folks who are attempting to work on behalf of the Ukraine situation there. Let's give a round of applause.
Thanks, everybody. Good to be with you.
Thanks so much again. Appreciate it. License business. We do thank you, Willie. And,
Thank you.